I'm very happy to see you here, and I'm very delighted to welcome you here, Tyler Coburn. You will give a lecture, as I learned. You will give a lecture called Ergonomic Futures. This evening's event is taking place in the frame of a series of lectures and talks under the title Today's Tomorrows, accompanying the exhibition Work It, Feel It, currently held at Kunsthalle Wien Karlsplatz, a group show which I strongly recommend, and which will be running until September the 10th. The exhibition and its accompanying program are revolving around the relations between the body and work. More specifically, they address the forming of the body for and through work, emphasizing on the fact that the working bodies today are not merely seen as instruments or tools for production and consumption, but have become, over the last decades, or almost over the last decades, also or as well the objects of work. Working bodies have to be individual, attractive, fit, in order to compete in a shrinking labor market where self-management, loading capacity, well-being are even more required than specific professional skills. So the work on the body has become a daily task, and our bodies have become at the same time effects and models of work, of work, of course, but of neoliberal, I would say, self-optimization and self-control. And in this context, Tyler's lecture, Ergonomic Future, will reflect upon new types of future human bodies, upon, let's say, scientific and ethic evolution about typologies and norms.
Thank you, Anne. I will briefly introduce Tyler Coburn with a few words. So Tyler Coburn is an artist and writer based in New York. He has studied at the Whitney Independent Study Program in New York. He's studied fine arts at the University of Southern California and literature at the Yale University in New Haven. He's so active in so many fields that I'm just going to briefly tell you some of them. So he's teaching, he has had numerous fellowships and residencies, he's published extensively and exhibited widely, doing performances, installation, writing, and sound. His interests are the mechanisms of today's technologies and also the interaction of bodies or organisms with interfaces, to say it very shortly. He has been participating at Kunsthalle recently in the exhibition The Promise of Total Automation in 2015. The project Ergonomic Futures, where we're going to hear one part of it today in the form of a lecture, is a multi-layered project which also takes material form as objects. I think we're going to hear more about that, and that can be seen at the Guangzhou Biennale, or could be seen, and as well as in Paris. I'm not going to say much more. I think you will take over at this point. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Anne and Eva. I'm very happy to be here, and I really appreciate the Kunsthalle making it possible for me to give this talk as part of the current exhibition. This project began in 2016, and it's an ongoing project. And as Eva mentioned, it comprises a few parts. So one of the parts is some furniture, and I'll show you images of the furniture during the Q&A that will follow the talk. There's also a website called ergonomicfutures.com, which I encourage you to visit if you have time. And then there's this talk itself. So, in the beginning, there's a model. More specifically, there's the tree. Sometimes it grows upwards from root to tip. Sometimes the branches get longer with each generation, like the neck of a giraffe. Sometimes they sprout leaves of as many kinds as there are beaks of a finch. Sometimes the tree is cut, and on its stump are the intricate veins that I'm told are us. Sometimes it's allowed to grow in the most novel ways, the branches feeding back into other parts of the tree, building you, me, and every eukaryote we know. Sometimes the tree isn't a tree, but a chain, a great chain, which once hung all the way from heaven to earth, which was known intimately by our ancestors, for it held them in perfect harmony. Everything was linked in the chain, even the ugly stone, the treacherous snake, and the louse. Nothing was an error of creation, because everything had a place. The trouble came with the human, who occupied a sensitive link between heaven and earth. Here was a creature whose wit and will distinguished him from his fellow animals, yet a creature substantially less perfect than even the stupidest angel. Surely God hadn't erred in designing the chain. Surely everything had a place. Surely, the scholars of the Enlightenment reasoned, it was the Elizabethans who had drawn the chain wrong, who left out links between humans and angels, links to be filled not by creatures of the known world, but by those from other planets, superhuman, subangelic beings. Unlike the extraterrestrials of the present age, those of the Enlightenment weren't foreign to humankind. They fit hand in glove with its logics. A few years ago, a group of alien believers approached Shara Bailey, an NYU anthropologist working on the dental morphology of early humans. They claimed that they had found an ancient jaw, and they were pretty certain that it belonged to an extraterrestrial. Shara agreed to talk to a television reporter covering the story. She said something to the effect of, "In my professional opinion, this jaw is a fake. There is nothing on earth that looks like this." Well, Shara's first sentence was cut from the broadcast segment, so she'll forever be remembered by the believer community as the scientist who said on broadcast television, "There's nothing on earth that looks like this." Shara told me that story about 2 years ago when I visited her office. I originally contacted Shara because I wanted her to imagine a scenario at some point between now and the bitter end of the universe, when our bodies experience such a degree of evolutionary change that the biological, ontological, and legal criteria of the human come undone when we undergo speciation. In Shara's opinion, outside of genetic engineering, the only way we'll see drastic change is if humankind fragments into groups, isolated by geography, culture, ideology. Owing to their limited scale, each group would experience low genetic variation, meaning that over generations, recessive traits would have the possibility of becoming prominent. This phenomenon is known as the founder effect, suggesting that the founders of a given community can have a huge influence on its gene pool. You can imagine the reasons why. There are a few famous cases of the founder effect. There are the Amish who suffer Ellis van Creveld syndrome. The syndrome wreaks havoc on the skeletal system, causing dwarfism and cleft palates, growing extra fingers and toes. There's a famous community in the Dominican Republic where most of the children are born female. Around the age of 12, some develop penises and become, biologically and culturally, boys. They're the Blue Fugates, a family that's lived in Kentucky since the 1820s, near the towns of Hazard and Troublesome Creek times. The founders of the Fugates were Martin and Elizabeth, who shared a rare genetic disorder. Their blood produced a surplus of hemoglobin that couldn't release oxygen into the body, thus turning their skin blue. As Martin and Elizabeth lived in geographical isolation, their condition spread over generations. The human equivalent of the Smurf clan was born. The Smurfs should be happy, but they're blue. A smile tells one story, and the skin another. Does the seclusion, the inbreeding make them so? The strain of maintaining a utopian life? Or the knowledge that, socialists or not, they're the essential ingredient for Gargamel to turn matter into gold? One of the blue fugates showed his family tree to a reporter. "You'll notice," he remarked, "that I'm kin to myself." Sometimes a tree isn't a tree, but a chain, and sometimes a chain is a chart. Its links compressed into tiny statistical points where the beggar, the dumb, and the deaf-mute, where every human has a place. The stone, the louse, and the snake can live on the charts of a different field. For the social statisticians of the 19th century, like Adolf Quetelet, the chain is a human chain, the coil, a human coil, its length stretched not from heaven to earth, but curved around an invisible bell and centered on an average man. Who is the average man? His figure, his face. How is life lived on the 50th percentile? It's strange to speak of an empirical fiction, but this human surely was one. Every time Quetelet added data to the chart, his average man grew less lifelike and less precise. These are his nearest approximations, his most truthful portraits. Here he is at dinner with his family, at work, riding a horse. There were some problems with Quetelet's model, particularly for members of the nascent eugenics movement. For one, the bell curve made the average man the norm. The scope of deviation thus included both the shorter and the taller, the dumber and the smarter, the browner and the whiter. To remedy this spread, the eugenicist Francis Galton reimagined the norm to be less a statistical reality than an aspiration, a hope, a want for social betterment, for selective breeding, for a kingdom of the taller, the smarter, and the whiter. The average man was one of the 19th century's many hallucinations. Francis Galton's composite portraits were among the most notorious. In these images, a different empirical fiction is on display. 3, 5, sometimes 9 portraits of criminals have been merged to reveal their common facial traits, to expose the fundamental likeness of the criminal type. Digital technology could intensify this technique pixel by pixel, layer upon infinite layer. But alas, composite photography is a thing of the past, another tombstone in the graveyard of pseudoscience. The norm no longer lives on the surface of images, but deep in the grain of the self. The Human Genome Project, according to David Serlin, is also a composite, an empirical fiction that invents norms for a genome in constant change. Donna Haraway has called it a standard reference work that purports to tame the unruly diversity of the species through the sheer power of exhaustive code. By sequencing our genes, we follow in the footsteps of Adolf Quetelet. We add data to the average man. We observe the scope of deviation. But to engineer the perfect human, we have to move in Francis Galton's direction. Galton had to rework Quetelet's bell curve to justify his eugenic practices. Genetics, in turn, must strive to do more than just plot and measure our genome, to engineer the perfect human, to incubate a designer baby. It must rid our genome of its every last fault. This one's a Kardashian. So I'll admit I'm a little suspicious of that argument, and not just for the obvious ethical reasons. There's a part of me that feels like this timeline has been reversed. We're inclining towards future perfection when perfection is a thing of the past. We're vesting our faith in science when, according to Celine Dion, we should be talking about love. Alcibiades said it best: Each of us is a mere tally of a person, one of two sides of a filleted fish, one half of an original whole. Once, we were double. I can look at my stomach and measure the scar where a lightning bolt cut me from my beloved. My head once turned in the opposite direction to make room for my missing half. As Alcibiades memorably recounts in Plato's Symposium, our anatomy was once very different. The original humans were of 3 sexes, not 2, the third remembered only in name as androgynous. These humans were perfectly round with 4 arms and 4 legs. They could walk upright like we do, and when they wanted to move fast, they would cartwheel around the world. As you can see in these authoritative historical renderings, the original humans had 2 heads facing in opposite directions and 2 sets of genitals, one for each head. How these genitals were put to use, Alcibiades never got around to explaining. Whatever you might think of their physique, these humans were strong and ambitious, even daring to climb the links of the chain in an effort to take on the gods. Zeus didn't like this, and he deliberated over what to do. A genocide would be the easiest solution, but that would deprive the gods of human worship. So instead, Zeus decided to split our ancestors in half, thus weakening the strength of the species. It didn't end there. Adding insult to injury, Zeus made Apollo turn our heads round, so that whenever we looked down, we're greeted by our navels, where the skin was knotted to close the cut. This wasn't a happy time for our ancestors. Those who once belonged together desperately tried to close the gap, hugging through hunger and even death, never removing a hand to seek sustenance for fear that it might re-break the bond. If one died, the other would seek a mate of the same sex, a consort who might suffice even in make-believe for the beloved missing half. Eventually, Zeus took pity on our ancestors. Their genitals were moved to the other sides of their bodies, making things somewhat more bearable. But still, the yearning for unity persisted. Still, we find ourselves enmeshed in its pursuit. Again, we humans are strong and ambitious. Again and again, the gods may divide us until we resemble the ruins of ancient statues, seeking a nose here, an arm there, seeking in the fragments of the decaying world that enduring thing called love. Over the past year, I approached a number of people, like I approached Shara, and I posed the same question. Is it possible somewhere between now and the suspension of everything that our bodies experience such a degree of evolutionary change that the human comes undone, fragments, or even ceases to exist? I wanted to know how a designer would answer this question, so I called Jonathan Olivares, who wrote the 2011 book, A Taxonomy of Office Chairs. Jonathan remarked that evolutionary change can't be envisaged in a vacuum. We need to consider the geographical, cultural, and ideological qualities of a community, as Shara had said. We need to study the broader environment. We also need to look to design, and particularly to ergonomics. These are fields that can respond to the practical needs of the human. They can also prescribe and evolve those needs. Ergonomics is a young discipline, a child of the Taylorist years, when its main task was to increase the efficiency of the working body, to minimize wasteful movements, to keep the eye trained on the machine, to quicken the pace of materials as they race towards the market. We know ergonomics better in its modern sense, popularized in Henry Dreyfus's 1955 book, Designing for People. Dreyfus's ergonomics focuses on enhancing the comfort of the human body in the workplace and beyond. The more comfortable a worker feels at his seat within his machine, the more productive he will be. Dreyfus was an interesting figure. In his early career, he designed theater sets in New York, which led to a commission for the 1939 World's Fair to create Democracy. Democracy was a diorama in the round that scaled democracy to the size of a future city. This was a greenfield city par excellence, where each and every resident could enjoy a garden apartment, a bucolic view, the landscaped highway to his job downtown, the landscaped highway for a swift retreat. Democracy claimed to depict the world in 100 years' time, though it was basically just depicting suburbia. In the 16 years between Democracy and Designing for People, Dreyfus zoomed in from his greenfield city to the intimate lives of its users, from utopian theater to the intricacies of ergonomics. The protagonists of Designing for People are Joe and Josephine, paragons of mid-century American gender. Joe can be found working on a linotype or in a tank, and Josephine over an ironing table or at a switchboard or, these days, a computer. Joe loses a limb. Dreyfus designs a fashionable new prosthetic. Josephine routes a call. Dreyfus tempers the strain. Ergonomics didn't limit itself to people like Joe and Josephine. Books from that era include design for the elderly and disabled, for children and the obese, for the standard US male body of Black, white, and Japanese descent, for the standard US female body of the same provenance. These diagrams appear to be more complicated than the charts of Adolf Quetelet, but let us not mistake what they share. The norm has gone granular, yet these are all still average men. The visuals change, but the tendency to typologize remains the same. In December of 2015, I met Ryan Raum, an anthropologist at Lehman College in New York. We discussed the popular depiction of aliens and future humans with exceptional mental and psionic abilities. You know these types of images. You've seen these heads, bulbous, veiny, obscenely brainy. I wanted to know if these figures could be borne out in reality, if we might evolve or engineer ourselves in the direction of such cranial majesty. Ryan presented two opposing arguments. The first is that there's no correlation between brain size and intellectual capacity. In fact, a smaller brain can have denser and more efficient neural connections. Moreover, the evolutionary record shows that our Cro-Magnon ancestor had a larger brain than us, and we're fairly certain of the complexity of its tasks: attack, defend, survive. So a big brain isn't a marvelous future novelty, but the IBM Mark I of cognitive processors. The opposing argument partly comes from a 2015 experiment which selected for female guppies with larger brains. Guppies are sort of a certain type of fish. It was found that these guppies demonstrated greater cognitive abilities and survived at a higher rate than their smaller-brained peers. Unfortunately, their adaptation came at a cost. The brain already draws a substantial share of the body's energy. For it to receive more energy, the rest of the body receives less. So the larger brain guppies were mentally superior, but only to the detriment of their gut size and their ability to reproduce. It may be that our descendants get to look like this. It may be that the bodily detriment will be seen as an acceptable cost, so we'll engineer these immense brains into existence. It may be that superior mental agents are already in our midst, hiding their talents in present-day skulls. These drawings come from Upton Sinclair's 1930 book, Mental Radio. Sinclair was convinced that his second wife, Mary, had telepathic abilities, which manifest in a kind of vibration, like a radio signal. To test his theories, Sinclair conducted 290 experiments, which went something like this. First, a person would make a drawing at random, then mentally focus on it for 5, 10, 20 minutes. Then Mary, sometimes as many as 40 miles away, would receive the broadcast and try to replicate the original. The original drawings are on the left, and Mary's drawings are on the right. On the backside of one drawing, Mary wrote, "This came in fragments as if I saw it being drawn by an invisible pencil." Sinclair's experiment didn't gain much traction in the scientific community. Of the 290 drawings that Mary made, only 65 were considered successful duplicates. This was not one of them. But still, something was in the air. J.B. Rhine published the book Extrasensory Perception 4 years after Mental Radio, so 1934, and university laboratories began to run experiments in the field with subjects of exceptional psionic ability guessing cards from a custom-made deck or receiving drawings at a distance and recreating them by hand, just like Mary had. Like many technologies of the 20th century, psionics found its way into warcraft. During the Cold War, the Russians were rumored to be training psychic spies. The CIA responded by creating 2 units in the 1970s, where agents mentally traveled to covert enemy sites and then described their contents in drawing, speech, even clay sculpture. These remote viewers, as they were called, basically flesh and blood prototypes of drones, flew the psychic airstreams in search of nuclear missiles, secret submarines, and tanks. They located pilots downed behind enemy lines and mentally communicated with enemy agents to extract sensitive information. These are some of the drawings made during test sessions with a psychic spy. He wasn't shown these photographs in advance, nor was the site that he was viewing described to him in any capacity. So the drawings are entirely based on what he psychically saw. There's a long history of psychics being deployed in warfare. There's John Dee, an Elizabethan spy who questioned angels through a crystal ball. There's Wolf Messing, a Soviet psychic of such renown that Hitler put a price on his head. It would seem that anything, even the lesser-known recesses of the mind, can be colonized and weaponized. Eventually, the psychic spying units came to a close. The CIA was lambasted by the media in the mid-90s when its spies came to public attention. Since then, several spies have gone on to write books about the subject, and some have begun training private citizens in the technique, ostensibly for predicting financial markets, sports betting, corporate espionage. I've actually been studying with one of these spies for the last year, and if any of you are in Stuttgart in November, you should join me for the project that's related to that training. The Cold War was a renaissance for psionics, before espionage became counterterrorism, when secrets lent themselves less to torture than to telepathic extraction. But the times, they've changed. We no longer need to imagine a group mind because we found one in cyberspace, nor wait to gain telepathic abilities, as telepathy-like machines will do. We live in an age when a thought has the power to move an avatar arm, and a word poised on the tip of our mind can be received by a brain somewhere else in the world, initially as quick flashes of lights, which can be decoded as digits, then letters. Perhaps it's time to revise that famous phrase, "She thinks, therefore I am." A moving arm and a flashing light may be as far as we get. Miguel Nicolelis, who has predicted the coming of neurosocial networking, doubts that emotions, memories, and higher cognitive states will ever be capable of transmission, for no two brains are exactly alike, and thus no thought can share the same neuronal position. Brain-to-brain communication, in his opinion, would likely require a feat of Borgesian proportions. 7,400,000,000 dictionaries must be written with the means of translating between them. Before the printing press, we enslaved ourselves to transcription, and soon, transcription may enslave the machines. So I approached Shara and Jonathan and Ryan, and still that question of mine persisted. I took the question to Seth Shipman, a fellow in the geneticist George Church's lab. This is George Church. He's like a polished version of Jerry Garcia from the Grateful Dead. If they put George Church's image on the cover of every book about genetic engineering, none of us would fear genetic engineering. We would just accept its future, like happy test tube hippies. Seth and I discussed a 2014 symposium on genetics and society, where Church claimed to have identified the genes that should be modified to make the human body survive better in extraterrestrial environments. Modifications to give us extra strong bones, lean muscles, lower cancer risk. If we take Church's human to its historical precedent, we arrive at a NASA research proposal from 1960, which imagines a human perfectly adapted to space. This human, according to the authors, could breathe without lungs and spacewalk without suits. What this required were exogenous devices, fuel cells to replace the lungs, feeding tubes to stave the labor of eating. Pressure pumps would be injected beneath the skin, triggering drug infusions to stave off the ravaging effects of radiation. When these mechanisms functioned effectively, they'd be so integrated into the user as to operate unconsciously. When they didn't function effectively, the human was presumed to be the problem. For instance, spacemen have been known to experience psychotic-like states due to the lack of sensory and motor variation. In such cases, drug infusions could be triggered remotely, from Houston or by a fellow crew member. For nearly every conceivable problem, drugs were the obvious solution. NASA's model astronaut was a human freed from biological limitations, yet bound by imperfect devices and doped to ease the pain of those imperfections, doped to palliate the anxieties of being haplessly invaded by the future. To describe this new human, the authors of this NASA report invented a word: cyborg. Sometimes a tree isn't a tree, but a chain. And sometimes a chain is a chart, left outside for so long that when it's found again, it's yellowed and tattered, pieces missing, pieces torn. The perfect model is beyond our reach, and what's left are oddities, embarrassments, and chimeric monstrosities. The chimeras of lore had lions for heads, goats for bodies, and snakes for tails. Sometimes they had the claws of dragons, sometimes glorious manes, always mouths filled with fire that imperiled any who stood too near. Chimeras are still among us, though we can scarcely distinguish them from the rest. Chimeras can even live in human guise, unaware of their fearsome gifts. Consider Lydia Fairchild. By chance, 2 of her mother's eggs were fused before insemination, causing Fairchild to be born with 46 chromosomes, or 2 DNA signatures. Unbeknownst to her, Fairchild was multiple people. This fact finally came to light in the early 2000s. Fairchild applied for public welfare, which required her and her children to take DNA tests. The tests revealed that Fairchild was not the mother of her children, leading the state to suspect that she was attempting fraud. Eventually, an additional DNA test was given to a baby that Fairchild had just birthed, like a representative of the state was there when she was birthing the child. And again, the DNA results revealed that this was not her child. So finally, the odd but correct conclusion was finally reached, that Fairchild was both the mother and the aunt of her children. Fairchild's case illuminates a larger trend, as personal testimony is losing credibility against genetic evidence. Genetic evidence, according to Aaron T. Norton and Ozzie Zenner, amounts to a technological confession for someone like Fairchild through a privileged objectification of her biological attributes. Though genetics is usually privileged for this supposed objectivity, there are some telling exceptions. Recent years have seen cases of transgender parents who have a genetic relationship to their children, yet find their parental rights nullified for not matching their original sex. What this example reveals is that far from being an objective force in contemporary jurisprudence, genetics is selectively deemed to be objective when it's aiding and abetting social norms, when it's affirming traditionalist thinking about identity and parenthood. Sometimes you judge a book by its content, but usually you just glance at the cover. To return to the original question, is it possible somewhere between now and whenever that our bodies experience such a degree of evolutionary change that the human comes undone? Chimeras may be a sign of things to come, for so thin is the line separating the human from the monster. What, for that matter, makes a human? The sugar and spice, the snips and snails? Francis Fukuyama calls it factor X, some combination of our sentience, our moral reason, our language, our consciousness. He knows the ingredients, just not the recipe. The bioethicist Joseph Fletcher claims that laboratory conception is as human as it gets, the perfect mode of reproduction for a creature with will, purpose, and choice. Unwittingly, Fletcher falls in line with Shulamith Firestone, who once argued that laboratory incubation would free women from their maternal servitude. Oddly, Fletcher rubbed shoulders with Randy Wicker, a gay activist who believes that cloning will make heterosexuality's historic monopoly on reproduction obsolete. You don't need to be hetero to clone. Perhaps Joseph Fletcher is right. Perhaps laboratory conception is as human as it gets. Still, laboratory conception is said to increase the chance of chimerism roughly 33-fold, which means the future may belong to chimeras. The Great Chain wasn't the invention of the Elizabethans, but of the Greeks. And it was less a chain at first than a product of paranoia, not a model of anything but the madness of Zeus. I'm experiencing a weird pop-up on my screen. Sorry about this. There we go. So the chain dates back to the Trojan War, when the gods were vying to stack the deck to be far more than bystanders to glorious war. Zeus responded with a warning. Any gods who played a role in the war would suffer no less a fate than exile, and any attempt to overthrow his authority would be tantamount to folly. He was too powerful to budge. Say the gods latched a chain to the heavens in an effort to yank him down. Well, Zeus would simply pick it up, give it a tug, and the rebel gods, their earthly minions, the entire carnal world would be flung through the cosmos to an untimely end. With a mere twist of his finger, Zeus could take control of the chain as a weapon, a keepsake, a necklace for the peak of Olympus. Zeus never acted on his threat, and his gauntlet kept hanging. With each passing year, it grew ever more like a chain. The natural world took a liking to this object. Creatures began to clamber up and take shelter in its links. By all accounts, they loved the altitude and the elliptical life. Gods come and go, and still this chain keeps hanging. Trees have sprung up around it, but if we look closely, we can see it. A weathered thing, more rust than metal, a testament to all we've forgotten to remember, to the worlds of old epistemologies, to the aliens of the Enlightenment. At some point, the future may reclaim this chain. For the ugly stone, the cyborg, the deaf mute, and the telepath to join together in lasting congress. For designer babies to have a trinket that reminds them of the world before human perfection. for mechanical overlords to ensnare the last vestiges of earthly life, pulling chain links around necks like a hangman would. For the founders of space colonies to climb their way to the stars to spread their genetic stock throughout this galaxy and the next. For citizens to have a cautionary tale of what comes from living within empirical fictions written by models, charts, and norms. Whatever purpose the chain will hold for those to come, it will keep hanging. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tyler. We could now open to the audience. Do you have questions you would like to ask to Tyler?
I guess I should say maybe...
something to the rest of Ergonomic Futures first?
Yeah.
Okay.
Just so you have a sense of what these seats look like.
So it's a multi-layered project, right? So you have this lecture, as you mentioned. I just repeated for those who came a little bit later, perhaps.
Yeah.
The lecture you just gave, some objects, sculptures, you showed at numerous occasions, and you will develop further, I think, and a free-form publishing platform, right?
Yes, yeah.
But my question would be about like the future material, the material of the future you use for the ergonomic future chairs.
Very good. So a lot of what you heard today comes out of the conversations I had with some of these different people. I think in total I've had maybe 10 or 12 conversations with different paleoanthropologists, evolutionary biologists, ergonomists, genetic engineers. There's always, I'm sorry, I'm getting this weird pop-up again. Okay, perfect. And then I work with some colleagues in New York who are architects. Their name is Bureau V. And we sort of take all of this research and ergonomically design furniture for these supposed future bodies. So part of the thinking here is to take the typological facets of ergonomics, right? The tendency to produce body typologies to design for, and throw that typology into the future. So somebody using the seat in the present might be able to understand through the principles of ergonomics who the seat is intended for. But it's ultimately a speculative process because the bodies the seats are made for are never described or represented or illustrated. So the seat is always available for use, and it's through use that one continues a sort of speculative motor at the center of this project. So it's a really big leap, suffice it to say. And to date, we've made 2 typologies, which are very different from one another, and I'll show you some images of them. So this is the first typology. We made 2 copies of this for the last Gwangju Biennial. So within the biennial, they functioned entirely as museum seating, and they were put in the service of the exhibition design team. They were put where the team felt they would best serve the layout of the show. The seats are designed following their initial exhibitions to be donated, one to a fine art museum and the other to an anthropology or natural history museum. So for instance, in the case of this seat, one copy of this seat is now installed in the Natural History Museum, Sodaman Natural History Museum in Seoul. It faces a very amusing vitrine of the evolutionary march, which ends with a skeleton of a monkey shaking hands with a skeleton of a human. I insisted that my seat go there. They were very happy to oblige. And the other is in a contemporary art space called Art Sanjay Center. The seats in Paris, starting in early 2018, one seat will be installed permanently in the Museum of Man, which is part of the Natural History Museum, is near the Eiffel Tower. Very fascinating, important research institution, very important role in the French resistance, very problematic museum. My seat is going near their rendering of the human of the future, which is a plaster life-size sculpture of a pregnant, disabled woman with a Fitbit sitting on a bench. So, but as you can tell from the lecture, hopefully, that I'm interested in occupying certain disciplinary problems, so I think having the seat near it will be helpful. The other seat in Paris is going in the Picasso room of the Pompidou, so also near some other representational problems. So if you find yourself there after early 2018, please visit. These are some detail shots of the seat. So Anna asked these questions about the sort of materials of the future. And in this case, actually, we sort of approached each seat differently. So in this case, we actually imagined a future scenario in which wood continues to be a valuable object for design purposes, but is in fact a scarce resource. So this veneer that you see here, this veneer is made out of actual wood, but it's fast-growing hardwood, scraps of which are laminated together and cut. So basically, these patterns are entirely fictive. They have no origin in nature, but the materiality is in fact real wood. So this was a scenario where we imagined that people were sort of taking what wood scraps they could and trying to produce something new out of it. So basically like a wood grain without a referent. How one sits on the seats is really to be determined. And on the last day I was in Guangzhou, I very creepily hung around the seats with a camera, and when people sat on them, I just took a lot of photos. As you can see from this image, the curatorial logic of where to put my seats was let's put it next to the other fractal thing. So in the end, I was not so thrilled. And you can't see from, this is the other placement of the seat, but if you just look left, you'll see other fractal sculptures. So I don't know. You're dealing with 110 artists. Sometimes you just have to act fast. This is an indeterminate little inlay in the seat. You can see it's sort of a Rorschach. Most people see it as something for the genitals, but I'm really not so sure that's what it is. So these are ways that I observe people using it. And of course, the child understands better than anyone else. This is the seat in Paris, very different. I should also say that with these seats, we were, of course, thinking about future design and future seating and what even seating means in the future. I mean, the reason I showed all those office chairs was because we're at a moment right now where sitting and working is in crisis. I don't know if any of you have standing desks or medicine balls or kneeling seats, but some of those questions also motivated this project at the outset. But in both cases with these seats, I was thinking a bit about also modulating from standard museum seating typologies. So in this case, I was thinking a little bit about the day bed. I'm giving away stuff here, but I found it fascinating when the day bed entered the museum as a piece of furniture because, of course, it implies lying, sleeping during the day. It has a reference to psychoanalysis. It was very commonly used in the sort of modern psychoanalyst office. So this is sort of proportioned with that in mind. Here, it's unclear how many people the seat is for, but generally lots of people use it. But I was thinking a bit about sort of social seating, histories of seats that are structured in a way that implies the possibility of multiple users. So this seat is made in a very different way and has a different approach to future materiality. It's fiberglass, and it's coated with a spray-on rubber, which was actually developed for the aerospace industry in the 60s, and it's considered to be one of the most durable finishes in the world, supposedly. We had to bake the seat for 30 hours to get it to bond. It was a really trying process. I say this, but please don't key the seat when you see it, because it's probably not as durable as the company advertises it to be. But in this scenario, we were thinking of actually a material that would last. Because in a very ridiculous way, I don't view these as prototypes of seats to come. These are the actual seats. They need to be around until the body comes into being. And this is part of the reason why, for the time being, they're pretending to be museum seats in actual museums, because the museum is the sort of rare place where this narrative of timelessness is performed. So because I have total faith that the Pompidou will exist for 10,000 to 100,000 years, I feel like it's the best place to keep the seat for the time being. So that's some background information, and alongside all of this, there's this website, ergonomicfutures.com, where you can see a lot of the writing sort of extrapolated in a different form, as well as stories that you haven't heard. And it's sort of designed like this great chain. That's not supposed to happen. Okay, pretend you didn't see that. I have no idea what's going on there. So some of the writing, that's not good. Well, it's always good to revisit your website in a public talk to learn about the clink. That also is not good. All right, I think it's maybe it's this. All right, I'm gonna assume that things will be corrected in the next day or two. We haven't really had issues with it since we developed the site. So hopefully if you go home and use it later, you'll find things that are perfectly operational. In any case, hopefully this gives a bit more of a concrete sense of how some of the project materializes in other formats. As Anne said, if any of you have questions or things you want to talk about, I'd be more than happy to chat.
I have perhaps one more question, if I may. You mentioned the fact that, perhaps in the future people will not sit anymore, or there will be new forms of sitting. I mean, sitting is anyway a cultural thing that has been...
Absolutely, yes.
What did the experts tell you about that, or what are the prognostic for the future?
It's really, I think it's contextual. So like I did with Sherry, you first have to sort of imagine a scenario, and then begin to consider what the built environment of that scenario would be. So first off, you're absolutely right, sitting itself is entirely a cultural construct, right? So what sitting means historically and in the present can have a very different registration in Austria and Japan and, Senegal, et cetera. But in one scenario, I talked with a genetic engineer about a science fiction book that he really liked when he was thinking a bit about designing for the post-planetary body. And it's a book called Falling Free from the late 80s by Lois McMaster Bujold. I ended up reading it. It's pulpy, if you like that. But in this case, it's about outer space asteroid mining, and they've genetically engineered a specific type of human to do this labor, because the body is a body that can perform very well in zero gravity conditions. So the racist term for this type of human is quadi. They're not technically human, they're a post-fetal experimental tissue culture owned by the corporation, so it's ontologically a little complicated. But they're called quadis because they have 4 pairs of arms. They don't have feet. So, and they don't need to sit because they're always in zero gravity context, so they just sort of hang in these sleep sacks that they tie themselves into, which astronauts also do. You see, when you look at astronauts' sleeping environments, they often have these types of strapping mechanisms, depending on whether they're in zero G or not. So that might be one thing to think about. Is sitting even relevant in the environment that you're in? So the quadi is more of it's like us reverting to chimpanzees, because having 4 graspable hands is much more useful than having 2 useless feet. I should say the sex scenes in this book are very complicated, but somewhat fascinating. So that was one scenario. A big question. Of course, at the center of this project, the big blind spot, there are many blind spots, but one is the presumption that A, we will survive long enough to change, and two, that there would ever be the conditions under which we would undergo any type of change other than genetic change, genetically engineered change. So the scenarios in which non-genetically engineered change have been imagined, you can look at again, going to science fiction, there are TV shows like The Expanse or The 100, or there's a good book from a few years ago called 7 Eves. 7 Eves is probably the one that's the most scientifically legitimate. It imagines a scenario in which populations of humans for about 10,000 years are living in isolation from one another. And that's really the only condition where basically inbreeding allows substantial change. So I think if you were to do it as a thought experiment, you would sort of first need to identify the circumstances of the community to then imagine what sitting could mean to it. Yeah. It was interesting talking to Jonathan, and this sort of speaks more directly to your show, Because Jonathan Olivares' book, The Taxonomy of Office Chairs, I mean, it's an intensely nerdy book in which he like goes through 200 years of office chairs, and like he'll just focus on like one part, like just like the small of the back of the chair, and he'll just show in a series of graphical drawings all of the permutations of it, and then he'll go to like the wheel, you know, or like the incline or all this stuff. But he believes that in this day and age, if we were to imagine a genealogy of the office chair into the future, we would actually need to stop the existing genealogy and start again from the couch or from domestic furniture. Because he believes that like with the increasing rise of teleworking and also people who have home offices or have very flexible and precarious working lifestyles, that domesticity will increasingly define or constitute what we might think of as the design and the aesthetics of the workplace. So that's his idea at the least. So start with like a really comfortable couch and then just make it slightly less comfortable, and you'll get to the new office chair, I think. I don't know.
But your chairs are always made for several people. Why? Like they are collective chairs, right?
What, this chair is actually just for one. I mean, it's a question, right?
Yeah, it's a question.
This chair is quite long. It's about, I'm sorry, I think in inches, it's about 9 feet long. It's what, 2.61 centimeters? I'm sure you all can do that math in your head right now. Yeah, it's not clear, but it's too long for a contemporary body. I mean, excepting certain basketball players and giants, but it's unclear how many people they're intended for. People sort of like intuitively felt like this was a more social chair, and were interested in that type of architecture. But in all scenarios, I've seen multiple people try to use this chair. And there's like a wonderful amount of Instagram footage of like Korean teenagers just doing what they do best on my chairs. So I guess one thing that I didn't mention, and it really comes from the talk, is that part of putting this ergonomic norm into the future is producing a chair that we are all abnormal in relationship to. Right? Nobody in the present, no matter what type of body you have, is the intended body for this chair. So some of the people that I referenced in the talk, like David Serlin, for instance, are disability theorists. And I mean, this is like, I don't know how the conversation is here, but in the States, it's quite active, these types of issues. So I was interested in producing a scenario in which we all sort of recognize the way in which what we think of as our everyday design is also, you know, to a certain extent, designed with particular typologies in mind. And by sort of producing this hypothetical future, even science fictional norm, it provides this sort of refracting lens to think a little bit about how certain notions of ability and design and fitness are constituted in the present. And of course, going back to the crazy pseudosciences of the 19th century, thinking about how we still live in the shadows of those histories. You know, it's really through disability theory that the Genome Project and sort of early pseudosciences and eugenicist practices are put into relationship to one another. So in that sense, I'm very, I owe a great debt to that scholarship. And if any of you are interested in those types of topics, I'm happy to give you a reading list after.
As you might notice, I came a little bit later. When I came in, I saw this a picture. Like you say, it's a human body with different links in different race, like black and white and Japanese. I just wonder, like, what's the matter, would you think, that make different race evolve in different ways? I mean, like, white people have their kind of feature, and black people and Asian people, we look different. Like, why you think, what do you think might cause the difference?
What causes the ethnic difference?
Yeah.
I mean, I think this is real. It's not irrelevant at all, okay. But I think it's totally outside of my depth to answer.
Okay.
I mean, I guess a side anecdote is that physiological appearance and ethnic makeup don't always work hand in hand. For instance, like my great-grandmother is Cherokee Indian, like I don't really look particularly Cherokee. And many of you have Mongol in you and probably aren't aware of it. I'm also like 1.5% Neanderthal, technically, if you go through my DNA heritage. So I don't know, I mean, like this is a sort of roundabout way, but while I was doing this, I got my family, my mom and my brothers a DNA test gift for Christmas so that we could do this together. And of course learned about the sort of different migratory patterns of my history, but the big shocker of the DNA test is that yes, we all are at least, like the average amount of Neanderthal we have in our DNA makeup, is about 1.3%. So I had more Neanderthal than the average human, which I'm really excited about. But the other big shocker is that like many of us have Mongol in us, because Genghis Khan was very, very active man in his time. I didn't have any Mongol, which I'm really disappointed to say. But it's just the ways in which different communities have developed. I think, what's his name? Ian Tattersall is a great evolutionary biologist at the Smithsonian. So like his book on this topic would be really good. There's a multi-part program that I watched while doing this project about the history of the human. But I think it speaks partly to what I was talking about earlier in terms of developing in relative geographical isolation. Because at a certain point you had predecessors to Homo sapiens that developed, for instance, in parts of Southeast Asia and elsewhere, species that died off at different points, right? And you had Homo sapiens moving to different parts of the world and developing with relative isolation from others. So these are some of the forces that account for ethnic difference. But I'm not the person to totally speak to it.
But like if every human, our ancestors are the same, then we just go to different part of the earth, so we develop differently. And what do you think about the future? Like, will the difference be expanded, or will we just come into this more like a similar form?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, like a few years ago, I mean, it speaks a lot to what's going on in America at the moment, because a few years ago, like Time magazine had a cover where it was like, this is the average American in like 2050 or something. And it's basically like, like sort of a vaguely Latin face, right? And there are also studies that particularly through nutrition, right, these differences of body typologies are changing. Like Asians are getting taller in general through changes in nutrition practices, Like in general, we're seeing that the strictness of these types of divisions, which themselves are super problematic and pseudoscientific, are changing. But in terms of stark ethnic change that isn't more like convergence and mixing, it would take conditions of isolation, or it would take racist genetic engineering. So, a post-planetary colony, like maybe that's a scenario. I like the show The Expanse. I don't know if any of you have seen it. It's on Sci-Fi. But it imagines a scenario in which there are 3 human populations in the future, one living on Mars, one born in outer space, and one on Earth. And the community in outer space is sort of implicitly a third world population. And they're lesser humans because by virtue of being born in outer space, they have much less muscle capacity, weaker bones, and they have their own sort of dialect, which is like sort of Rastafarian Esperanto. They really commit to it. So it like sort of works in the show. But I think this is an interesting show to look at the least, where like everybody's still a human. Nobody is a super evolved, but just by virtue of growing up in different gravity and radiation environments, you start to see the bodies change. The show The 100 is absolutely ridiculous because they go up to space for like 100 years and then they come back and like already like entirely new cultural systems of humans for the humans that remain on Earth have emerged. It's like absolutely preposterous. But there are some cases, also that book Seven Eves that I mentioned, where you can start to imagine what would be maybe more legitimate scientific conditions for change. Yeah.
this would be for working, these seats? Would you imagine?
It's a question. I mean, for the time being, it's in the museum, but it's in the museum, as I say, because that's where I need to store it, right? But I thought of this as a working seat, actually, this one.
Okay, and then the next part of my question is, did you consider in your research how we would eat in the future and sit around and eat? Would that change as well, or would you expand on this, and what would that look like? Because the other seat reminded me of like the Romans, where they would lounge to eat.
Oh, yeah.
And I don't know, I just had this thought, and I wanted to ask you.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and as I said earlier, like once you start to even imagine these seats, you have to imagine larger environmental conditions. We didn't think too much about eating. I am interested in expanding this project in different ways. I recently did a fitness workshop in Taipei, which was sort of like trying to think through like sort of how body ideologies are being, to make a really bad joke, exercised in the present. And so we produced a sort of like propositional fitness class for bodies that don't exist normatively at the moment, not necessarily future bodies, but bodies that are absent from the regime of fitness. So I think eating could be very much another way. And I can imagine that within the realm of molecular gastronomy, you probably already have sort of crazy scientific gastronomes who are, if not imagining what the culture of eating in the future looks like, probably making the food of the future. But it's a really interesting question, what the sort of social space of eating is, or if we even need to eat anymore. I mean, the NASA human that was designed never had to eat. They were like, oh, this human will appreciate so much that we just like pump the food in through the tubes. You know, eating is so annoying. It takes so much time. You know, I think this aspect of like trying to minimize labor or assuming what's a chore as opposed to what's a pleasure is interesting. This is a total side note, but I'm very fascinated by the history of writers who wrote with a catheter in. You know what a catheter is? It's a tube that goes into your penis so that you pee, you know. So Rousseau, for instance, was known to write with a catheter because he just felt like going to the bathroom was just this thing that was a waste of time to get up, to, you know, lose his train of thought. So he just preferred to keep it in. This might be apocryphal, but for me, even going to the bathroom is like a pleasure of life, you know? Like, I don't, oh God, it's a really bad thing to end on. Anne, are you gonna end on that? Anne, can you just say something sophisticated now so that, can we just cut the tape? No,
it's good to leave it as it is, I think.
Okay.
Or do you have another question? Nope? Okay, thank you very much, Tyler.
Thank you.